the computer. Here we go. Okay, welcome back, folks. Day 4 of the Social Studies Summer Institute. And no, it's day 3 of the Social Studies Summer Institute.
Tony, you're losing it here. You're losing it. You're losing it.
I'm definitely losing it. That's for sure.
Just stop recording, restart.
No. We're going to keep it. We're doing this one take. That's for sure. So we are in the home stretch today. In this session, we are going to look at some of the draft standards. This group of people are going to be the first folks to look at the standards that are being drafted for the standards project. Just a little bit of a recap. They went to the editor on the editing team, on Tuesday. And today we have the first little sample that they're willing to share with us. So we are going to go over that today in just a little bit. And we're going to use the prototype rubric to evaluate the standards that have already been presented. So this will be sort of like a little cohort of guinea pigs. I hope you're okay with that. You're going to let us know if the rubric makes any sense, if we're going in the right direction with the standards. So we're going to get some initial feedback right here. So when the document comes out, you're going to be able to say, hey, I should be credited as an editor on this document. If you're interested in that, email Steve Armstrong. He'll help you out. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. I am going to just go over just a little bit. Oh, that's not the right thing. A little bit of information, just a little bit of review, because not everyone that's here right now was here yesterday. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to spend some time imagining curriculum. We're just going to think about curriculum just to get our minds right. And then we're going to review the project purpose. We're going to talk about what high quality standards look like. We're going to review some sample standards. And if we have some time at the end, we're actually going to have you write some of your own standards, So first off, I'd like to just turn our attention to the image and this quote from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. And we have some questions underneath here. And my question is to the folks at home that are viewing, what do you need to know or be able to understand about this moment in history? Like, what learning must precede this point in the curriculum? What do we think? What are some ideas? What are some things that we need to make sure students understand before we get to this point in the curriculum? We'll take any responses. And we chose this topic because I thought it was an easy entry point for, Declaration of Independence. Independence Day is coming up in a couple of days. This is something that a lot of people know. What do you think young people need to understand before they can truly understand what's happening at this moment in history?
They should know why there was a desire for independence.
Good.
Also who these men are. So
Good.
Talking about the founding fathers, what are their roles? I guess before we get into the document itself.
How about what type of government existed before that they have to write this?
Okay, good. What else do we need to know?
Independence from who, what?
What are rights? What are those things?
Right, good. So here's the next question here. Oh, go ahead, Lauren. Nope, go ahead.
Just thinking about the principles too, although these words sound all encompassing, we might want to point out that they aren't actually. So that might be another lesson, but we may have to address that as well.
Good. At the very bottom of your screen is a list of the themes that we're trying to include in the overall standards document: justice, representation, inclusivity, global context, agency, local connections. How might a teacher be able to make some connections to these themes when thinking about this topic? How can we make some connections?
We could ask,
Let's go to Tracy first. Go ahead, Tracy, and then we'll go to Robin. Go ahead, Tracy.
well, just, to ask students to notice who is in this painting, and who is not in this painting.
Good, good. Robin?
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Oh,
Who's at the
great
table,
minds.
who's not. Yeah.
Great minds. What about some other connections to the themes down here? Go ahead, Allison, get in there.
Why not? In terms of global context, you may want to bring in the Enlightenment, what's going on with thinkers elsewhere, what ideas are getting, I hate to use the word plagiarized, but maybe plagiarized here from some thinkers
Borrowed.
outside the United States.
Awesome. Any other connections we can make here? Maybe Deanna or Jen?
I think you just think of local connections, who are the people, right, representing Connecticut and perhaps where they're from.
Yeah, Roger Sherman, right? Hey, one of my heroes.
With my younger student hat on, look at the flags. What are they? What do they represent?
Yeah, good, especially for representation. I was thinking about agency, like people having to like strike out and do this on their own, sort of a thing. I think Tracy had a point. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the comment that I made before about who's in the painting and who isn't, I was thinking about inclusivity, but I'm also thinking about, in terms of the quotation from the Declaration of Independence, just the use of gendered language, and thinking about that relative to the theme of representation.
That's valid. That's
Well,
valid.
and Tracy, not even gendered language too. There's also like, who's the creator? What's that capital C all about? Who are we talking about?
Mhm.
I was going to say with justice, even just ensuring having a discussion about some of the terms like rights, life, liberty, happiness, like what do those things mean and entail?
Mhm.
And have they changed over time?
That brings us to our next question here, which has to do with past-present connections. How can we make a connection to what's happening in history, which just seems for young learners, all learners, like it's a millennia ago, almost it's just a storybook sort of representation. What are the connections that we can make to what's happening today?
I mean, this is so obvious, but Robin's calling attention to those phrases, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Supreme Court for the first time basically erased a constitutional right. It's obvious, but
I don't think that's necessarily obvious to everyone. I think that's a valid point. Thank you for that. I'm thinking about the rule of law and the value of the rule of law as something that is a past present connection. Either if you're looking at the current commission that's happening in the House of Representatives, I think that there's a connection there. It also maybe makes me kind of think about international relations in a way. Who establishes sovereignty and what does that mean to have sovereignty? Is another past present connection.
Tony, also like you could do something with just the terminology being used here, the vocabulary. I work with a lot of English language learners, but the liberty is a completely evolving abstract noun, right? Same with happiness. Like, what does that mean? And it's such an individualized experience. Not to say that it means something different now holistically than it did in the 18th century, but what did it mean in the 18th century even? It's not well defined here. And these are conversations, right, that are taking place at the levels of the Supreme Court, in state governments, in local governments, at Board of Education meetings too, right? So I think there's a lot to do here with just the basic vocabulary.
That was actually making me, sorry, I'm going to just think on that a little bit. It makes me think about like, maybe students should be defining what life, liberty, and happiness means to them in this moment today, And then like you're saying, going back and let's look at, what would Merriam-Webster say, back in the 17th century or the 18th century, excuse me, like how would it be defined, and doing like some comparing and some contrasting. That's actually a really interesting idea, Allison. Thank you.
Dictionaries are super cool because especially if you use like the Oxford English, like it goes back and traces, right, the history of each one of these words. So you can, even if you had like certain types of student, you could even go back and look at the genealogy of a word to see how it's changed, which is kind of cool. But that's a whole nother.
Okay, let's move on here. Let's do some. We just did the engage. Let's move. I'm using a constructivist approach. Somebody brought this up the other day, constructivism. So I'm using a constructivist approach today. So we just did the engage. We're going to explore a little bit. We did some exploring by talking about it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to just give you a little bit of explanation. So I went over this yesterday, but I'll be brief. Remember, the task for the standards project is to add content to dimension 2 of the frameworks. Okay, and we talked a lot about this with inquiry over the first day and a half. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday. How are we doing that? We're taking the original frameworks, we're pulling out the indicators, and from the indicators, we're drafting standards that are in blue here at the bottom. And basically, this is a 5th grade example. We actually centered a lot of our thinking and a lot of our work with 5th grade because we felt that that was a nice transition between elementary and secondary. Right, so that we could think about what are our 5th grade learners doing, and then how can we scaffold that down, and then also how can we build upon that. So that's just so everyone knows, we did a lot of our centering of our thought in elementary at the 5th grade level. Continuing on from that, this is what a sample organization looks like. I know you saw this a little bit yesterday. We have the indicators in black, and then we have the grade level standards written in blue. We're actually going to be looking at some of these. We're going to be looking at the grade level standards and the indicators today in just a moment. Don't worry about the numbering system. The document you're going to see is not going to have a numbering system. We haven't figured that out. The numbering system, it's actually very complex to figure out how you make it in a way that shows the vertical integration and progression of standards over the course of 12 years. It's actually kind of complicated to come up with something that makes sense. So we're going to worry about that in a minute. The thing I'd like you to draw your attention to right now is, well, what I have on the screen, of course, but I'm also going to drop into the chat, if I can find the chat. I'm going to drop into the chat here it is, I found it. The checklist, the draft checklist that we're using, or we will use with the writers to review the standards that are written. So I just dropped it in there. It's a PDF. You're also going to be able to find this in the folder that we've been sharing all week. And basically, we've narrowed down high quality standards into these categories, or these headings, I guess you could say. They need to be measurable. They need to be appropriately challenging. They need to be connected. And there's several defining factors of each one of these. Clearly worded, scaffolded, and specific. These are the 6 broad categories or broad headers that we feel that standards should be able to fall into. And so what we should have up on our screen, or hopefully you have up on your screen, you're able to download the draft checklist. And I'm just pulling it up on mine. I'm actually going to stop my share if I haven't done so already. No, I already have. Good. And basically what we're looking at here, if it's measurable, can an assessment of learning be designed from that indicator? Can we create something where we can assess whether or not young people have learned something? Is it appropriately challenging? Is it like developmentally appropriate? Connected? Does it like build upon prior learning and connect to future learning? That's kind of what we started our session with today. Does the indicator start with an action verb? Does each indicator include only one topic or thought? That's actually really challenging to narrow that down. Is it scaffolded? Meaning, does the verb level of the indicator reflect the highest level of thinking, feeling, and doing that's appropriate for the grade level? And does it connect to content-based learning progression? And specific, does it provide a benchmark? And is the indicator using precise language? Down here at the bottom, now this is for looking, so the top is for looking at individual standards. one standard, you look at these 6 criteria. Now, the group of standards, so let's say within a unit or a topic of standards, does it also connect to being connected? Meaning, is it a comprehensive and inclusive representation of events, issues, and context? Are the 4 core disciplines of social studies adequately reflected? So history, economics, geography, and civics. Do the standards allow for critical analysis of the role of power and bias in history? Are the themes represented? Justice, representation, inclusivity, global context, agency, and local connections. Can we see that in this group of standards? And finally, scaffolded. Do the concepts build off of previously mastered content or concepts? And is the content in the standards indicators a prerequisite, for future learning? And is the learning progression free of gaps? So this is what we're going to use to evaluate the standards. Now, outside of the project associates, no one has seen this rubric, just this group of 8 educators here. You all are getting the first inside look at that. So thank you for joining us. The next thing I'm going to put into the chat is the draft. Now, it's a very small draft. It's just a sample of a couple of grades. We have 3rd grade included. I just dropped it into the chat box. And we also have, I think it's high school. I guess I should open it before I start talking too much. And we have high school available as well. So grade 3, and then US history at the high school level. What we're going to do is we're going to take some time to look over what we have written. The bullets are the content that was added. So you'll see, so if I'm looking at the top where it says grade 3, there's 2 themes that are listed. Each of the courses is going to have 2 kind of like curricular themes, okay, that are going to drive the work. And then also underneath it, you'll see that there's
Tony,
what was an indicator, distinguish the responsibilities and powers of government officials at various levels and branches of government and in different times and places, which is a very abstract learning objective. Now what we've done is we've added some content, and those are the bullet points that go underneath it. So let's look at 3rd grade first. Does this seem appropriate for 3rd grade? Let's evaluate it against that rubric.
Somebody has a question, Tony.
Oh, please, yes.
sorry, Tony. So on this draft standards document, when you say have themes here, you're not referring to the 6.
No, yeah, I know that is confusing.
Okay.
No, you're right.
Okay, just checking.
Sometimes there's a lot of language being thrown at us, right? The themes that we've been talking about all week, those 6 themes, those themes are guiding the overall development of all of the standards. Each course is also going to be guided by a curricular theme or content themes. So yes, we're going to have to clean up the language of the word theme. Clearly, Jen is shaking her head yes. We have to clean that up a little bit. So bear with us. It is a draft. Thank you for pointing that out. I agree. It is also confusing. So let's just take some time. Let's look over just grade 3 and let's evaluate, unless there's other questions first.
Tony, you notice on the US history, it's called course themes. It's just not called that up in the grade 3.
Yeah. Great point. Thank you. I'm sure they're going to edit that together. So is anyone fortunate enough to teach grade 3? Lucky enough to teach grade 3 here? I know we have some elementary folks with us. What do we think about these drafts standards here? Are they doable?
Tony, a question I have on it.
Sure.
I think they're doable, but it's interesting that 1, 3, and 4 require some level of thinking and understanding, where bullet 2 is simply the name of a person. And I'm wondering, is that okay, or would you want some equal level of complexity for all the bullets?
Can I jump in just to share some thoughts that I know came up in our group, and I'm sure Allison might have had some similar conversations. We felt like we were sometimes straddling that line between standards and giving some examples, along with like not getting into curriculum writing. And so there were times where people would say, let's use a very high level depth of knowledge verb for what we want students to do. And then it's up to the district curriculum writers to just scaffold, right? That was one viewpoint. And another conversation that then circled around from that was, but with limited time, sometimes in elementary, how are we going to ensure that kids know at least the bare minimum, right? That we could all feel comfortable with. So I know I can say for high school civics, we have a few of those that are more identify some of those lower levels. And we questioned it, we highlighted, we have all of our verbs in bold right now. So I don't know if there's a happy medium depending on the content. Allison?
Yeah, Jennifer, just to kind of add to that, right? Like the frameworks that were created a few years back were audited by some like nonprofits like the Fordham Institute, and the Connecticut frameworks, which the standards are based on, were critiqued for not being specific enough, right? For being too vague in certain areas. And so again, trying to strike that balance of incorporating content without it becoming curriculum. I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, right? It's a struggle, but I think because there is no right or wrong necessarily, to some degree, it's a matter of taste and preference, based upon who's looking at the standards and based upon in Connecticut, what region they might be from too.
Well,
let's get Tracy and then Robin in there. Go ahead, Tracy.
Just to make an observation, I feel like, building on like what Steve said, I feel like number 2, the second bullet point, is encompassed in number 4, the fourth bullet.
I see that.
So that's the question. Would that be the type of scaffolding so that we no longer would need number 2? Because that would be up to the curriculum writers to embed that in their actual lesson planning.
Thank you for that critical.
Or
let's go to Robin real quick, and then we'll come to you, Steve. Hold on.
yep, sorry.
No, you're okay.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I find this specificity very helpful, because I've been working on trying to dig into the K-5 standards, and I've seen a lot of overlap that's created a lot of interpretation on my part, where I've kind of been wondering sometimes, like, well, how deeply, for example, in second grade, are we supposed to dig into understanding government? Or like, is this expectation, for example, of what we're doing here in grade 3, could that have been previously before something they did in grade 2, because it wasn't as specific? So I think this is going to help prevent that duplication and that overlap, which we're talking about with teachers who don't have a lot of time in elementary school, where they're wanting less topics and less things to focus on, to really go deeply, perhaps with fewer things. The other thing too, in regards to still having curriculum and having it be specific, when I think about mathematics is more of my expertise, but mathematics standards are very specific. However, when you go, and that's helpful to distinguish between the grade levels, but what districts can have autonomy on is the resources and the activities that they do in order to go about implementing those. So I think it's helpful to have that specificity. So as kids are transitioning from different schools or different towns, it helps out to distinguish among the grade levels. So I really appreciate that. I think it's helpful to know exactly what that expectation is and where the limits kind of are in that vocabulary. Like, what words are we looking for? What specific examples in Connecticut? I find it helpful.
Great. And back to Steve. Sorry, Steve. Thanks.
Very briefly, and probably this isn't the appropriate time for this, but how about identify the elected leaders and their roles? That kind of takes part of number 4. And then 3, explain the roles of the 3 branches of government in Connecticut. Isn't number 4 in essence a repeat of that? Explain roles of government at local and state levels. See what I'm saying? I think,
I see what you're saying. I almost wonder if there should be a separate standard for each branch of government. I mean, I wonder if that would be, and that, I know it's more specificity, which is kind of the opposite way that you're going,
right.
but I think people might appreciate that.
My only point initially was that 1, 3, and 4 required some thinking and analysis, and number 2 is just to identify a name. That was my initial thought.
Mhm. What about what we have here in, oh, go ahead, Tracy.
The first part of number 2 is just identify. But then the second part, explain who makes the important decisions concerning community and educational issues. I mean, you've got the explain in there, and I feel like that is similar to bullet point number 4. So
I agree.
can I ask a question about grade 6 and 7?
Yeah, well, first off, let's preface this one. That's the hardest group. That's the hardest set of standards that we're working on. We know that it needs the most amount of attention, and it's different in every school does it differently, or every system does it differently. Some people have 6th grade in elementary, some people have 7th grade in middle school. How do you have 2 grades and 1 set of standards? Yes. So go ahead and ask your question, but we know that it's already a really tough topic. So go ahead.
I was just going to ask whether there were going to be course themes for grade 6 and course themes for grade 7, whether that's going to be separated out or whether it's going to be just one sort of group of everybody's smiling. Please separate.
We are going to, we haven't made that final decision, but it seems like we're leaning towards separating 6 and 7. 6 being more foundational skills for geography, and 7 being more like movement, human environment interaction, the more like theoretical applications of geography.
So
personally, thank you for bringing that up. Thank you.
If 6th grade is focused on foundational skills, is it going to sort of meet those? I guess when I hear that, what goes through my mind is it going to be able to get into those 6 themes of justice, inclusivity, representation, agency? Like if it's just, I feel like, I'm not a social studies expert, but I feel like traditionally, what I think of and what I see in classrooms is, labeling maps and things like that, and that's not inquiry. So, so that's my only worry about when I mean, you guys know, but when I hear, foundational, I hear sort of here's not the right word. My concern would be the retreat to the traditional.
Yeah. Steve, you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I think
yeah,
the only
well,
thing I'd say
I
is we're gonna
can
keep it
tell
in mind.
you that we're I would be horrified, Tracy, if the course was doing maps. I think the problem that we have, and this would be done through inquiry, but I think the problem that we have is some students are coming to middle school with very little or zero social studies. So we have to have, I think, and it's going to be through inquiry. There has to be some introductory, I think, if we're going to call it a unit or something, to at least make sure people are on the relatively same playing field. But this would not be done through it would be done through the process. We would get at the necessary skills through the process of inquiry. Jen, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that we've also connected the idea of what types of skills connecting to geographical skills that students would learn or need in grade 6 and 7 to what most of them are experiencing grade 4 when we're looking at US regions, because that's another course with a heavy focus on geography. And so again, being aware that every elementary school across the state might have different time allotments for social studies, we want to make sure that grade 6 and 7 can reiterate those 5 themes of geography, those basic skills. But our hope is that we can more strongly embed those skills in our 4th grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, so that there'll be some type of intro unit, but maybe not as lengthy as it might have been in the past.
And another thing about, very briefly, about 6 and 7 is I've heard it, we've all heard it loud and clear about resources. And there's 2 interns that are starting in the State Department of Ed on August 1st. And their first task is going to be, and they know this already, is going to be to accumulate learning materials, appropriate primary sources, et cetera, for the 6th and 7th grade classes. Because if there's one challenge, it's getting appropriate primary sources, especially for those grades.
I just have my question about what Jennifer was saying, and not just Jennifer, but Steve, Tony, about the need for an introductory unit. When we start talking about that, aren't we then talking about curriculum and not standards? Like, I'm just trying to visualize what that looks like in the standards document.
So that's another one of those key terms. So I can say that when we started to organize our standards in these drafts that you see, we start, like you'll see it on the high school one, we referred to it as a unit, and maybe it's not the best word choice, but like topics, right? So what would be the big topics that we know in a US history course at the high school, the big topics that everybody's going to cover, which may or may not be organized by unit for some schools, right? So if that makes more sense. So my use of the term unit in that sense was more that, as opposed to a curriculum unit. As Tony said, we're struggling with some of our language that we need to use to clarify the differences at different levels in our document. But
and
by the time we
Tracy,
have this, go ahead, Steve.
Tracy, if the educators determine that all of those standards, those introductory standards are met, then there's no need to do them, right? If we have said that, if the introductory standards leading into 5th grade, if they're all met, as they might be in some districts, you don't need any. And your point is very well taken, that mandating a unit or something is a curriculum thing and not a standards thing.
Very good. And then just to the point about the definitions, we're, like Jen just said, we are massaging those. There's going to be a whole introduction to the standards document that defines all of the different terms that we're using, just so it's very clear. We understand how important it is to be clear in our language, and that language matters a lot, especially when you're defining between standards and curriculum. Like, we're really trying to make sure that we're not writing curriculum and that we are writing standards. And that's hard because a lot of folks never had the opportunity to write standards before. So it's they're used to writing curriculum. They're very good at writing curriculum. We have amazing people on these teams, I'm telling you. But to get them to start thinking about, okay, what's one step removed from writing that unit objective as opposed to writing a standard, that's a fine line sometimes. And we were even, in terms of terminology, at one point we were throwing around the word objective instead of using the word standard, right? So we had to push that away. Like, people are going to get confused. We got to say standard because that's what objectives goes in your curriculum. If we could, let's scroll down to US history. Let's look at US history now. And it's a little bit more developed. You'll notice it does have the same thing. It says course themes, to Steve's point, as opposed to just themes, right? So course themes, these are the 2 things they're going to be looking at. And you see the word unit here. To Jen's point, maybe it should be topic, which is how it's listed in the elementary, right? Again, we've only had 1 day of revision, so like there's still a lot of rawness here. So this is like a topic. All right, what do we think about this one now here? What do we think here? Is it doable, actionable, specific, clear? Does it tie to the themes? What do we think?
Tony, could I ask you or Allison or Jen a question?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Allison is the leader of the writing team. We're looking specifically at her work now. So
Allison, I got to ask you a question, just to clarify for me and for everybody.
Sure.
I'll assume I'm the only one that doesn't know this. Are the bullets suggested activities, or are these the activities that you're suggesting?
These are the standards, right? Yeah. So the thing that's not bulleted is what comes from the frameworks, and the bullet is the content that they've added so that.
So my question to you, Allison, is, are these suggested? Are these suggested or the?
So at the moment, these are being, as we speak, looked at by an editing team. So they are suggestions, but they're pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not concrete, they're not absolutes, but they're recommended to be part of the document to get what we've been calling the grain size of examples. Sorry, my dogs. To get that grain size of specificity that, say, like the Fordham Institute criticized our frameworks in Connecticut for not having, to incorporate those into the standards, if that makes sense. And again, I apologize for my dogs.
I mean, I think to Steve's question, like all of our standards are suggestions, right? I mean, nothing in Connecticut is you have to do this thing, but these again are like the standards that we are suggesting that you cover as part of your U.S. history curriculum. Does that answer your question, Steve?
No, I'm just trying to, I'm asking obtusely, is like assess the impact of internment on Japanese Americans. Is that a thing we're telling people to do, or is that a suggestion to them?
Got it. You
that
mean
they do this?
Writing the curriculum? Got it. Yeah, no, it would be written as a suggestion, right? These are some of the hot topics that we suggest that you cover.
So in speaking of on the same thought, what's in the parentheses, are those what students are expected to know by the end of this? So because we know that they're going to be on some standardized test some way down the road, like, is that why they're in there? Are those hints to make sure you talk about?
Well, to Robin's point earlier, there's sort of like suggested content examples that you could potentially start with if you were writing curriculum, because ideally this document, teachers will be looking at it and they'll be using it, but it is designed in many ways for people working at the administrative level, writing curriculum. And they might need a little extra guidance as to some of the content that they should be looking at in order to help these standards move along in the high school level in this particular case. But it's not like you have to teach them. Also, the way it's written, there's sort of suggestions for editors and an editing team to look at the moment to say, hey, here are some of the major content pieces that came up. Like, for example, this particular work of literature, do you think that this should be incorporated somewhere? If so, editing team, where would you suggest that go? And if not, axe it.
I feel like, looking at this, there's a sort of continuum of general to specific, right? So, and I feel like in a lot of cases, the bulleted points that are the standards, if I'm understanding correctly, they're not so specific in most cases. I mean, I feel like the one about Japanese internment, that one's a little bit more specific, but comparing, contrasting key events in World War II, using evidence to debate the way in which each event was a turning point in the war, I don't feel like that's so specific. But then what's in parentheses seems more like specific suggestions. Like you could turn the bullet point there into an inquiry and kids could discover the stuff that's in parentheses. So I didn't feel like the bullet points were, too specific. I didn't think.
That's definitely been one of the struggles with conversation, again, that we've had in groups, is at what point or for certain topics do we need a level of specificity in the standard itself, as opposed to just being an example in parentheses after.
Isn't that what teachers asked for, though? We wanted more of that. We wanted more guidance in that case. So I think you guys did a good job in giving that. And if I were a teacher receiving this, a new teacher to this district that saw this piece of paper, I would feel way more comfortable with this than the pages and pages of what I got last year.
Allison, could I ask you, the last bullet? If I wanted to change praise the role, and I wanted to change that to of African Americans on the home front and in the military, that's okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Though we haven't, to be fair, Steve, we haven't gotten the terminology completely down yet. It would probably be Black and African American,
Correct.
the final document.
I was just gonna comment on noticing that I see more of the themes here. So there's a greater connection, not just to identifying what standards should be addressed, but also how the curriculum could then lead to the changes that we've been discussing for the past few days about those major themes of justice and, you know, the other topics we're trying to see incorporated throughout the social studies curriculum.
Can I ask a question just to the group? And feel free to answer or not. One of the goals of this particular, I think, mission in general, right, was to create a document that spoke to moving more in the social studies towards into the 21st century. The US documents are probably, or posed to be potentially the most controversial of the forthcoming standards. There's been a lot of conversations about what either to incorporate or not to incorporate when it comes to like a diversity standpoint, from a justice standpoint. And we erred on the side of caution, but tried to push the envelope as best we could. Does that come through, or do we need to do more?
I see it coming through. Just this first glance, it's evident that that's being done. And this is just, I'm an amateur, I don't know much about it, but just as people were mentioning before, Tracy and Lisa mentioning, like, if I were a teacher receiving this and I had to start creating lessons from this, with everything we've discussed so far, I feel equipped to go in that direction.
Okay. Thanks, Laura.
Okay. And that's a good thing, obviously, for that's.
Allison, I feel like the second to last bullet point on the impact of internment on Japanese Americans, the second part of that sentence and the connections to American ideas of equality and justice, it's really explicit. And the next one, appraise the role of women on the home front in the military during World War II. I'm not sure that it comes through in that one. So sure. I know you don't want to like keep restating the themes over and over again, but I do wonder, I guess, if there's a way for it to come through.
Well, now that you say that, I think there might be, Tracy, and I'm happy you brought that point up. There might be a way to incorporate an extension to that, right? That suggests the temporary nature of women's role having independence and autonomy. Because there's also some themes in the Cold War unit, right, that are going to hint at the fact that women lost that privilege.
Okay, well.
I have one suggestion for your checklist, if I may be so bold.
Be bold.
So I'm looking at the clearly worded. And then it says, does the indicator start with an action verb? So when I think of action verb, I think of run, walk, jump. I think it's more of a cognitive verb or a thinking verb. Those are two words that I've heard to describe verbs like analyze, explain, synthesize, etc. But action verb, action, they're not action verbs.
Great point. Love that. I'm going to change it to cognitive verb. No, I'm going to ask anybody. I'm just going to change it. All right. Any other comments on this section? Great.
Your
I was gonna
comments
have
were
us all close up
invaluable.
with like, go ahead, Steve. What's that?
No, your comments were invaluable. Thank you very much, you guys.
Yeah, I took a
Greatly
bunch of notes. I'm actually gonna, as soon as we get off this call. All right, so I'm gonna move outside first, and then I'm gonna write an email to the editors to just, and here's what I've just jotted down. Just let me know if I'm missing anything here, okay? You're gonna help me craft the email. Number one, the language needs to be clear. Unit versus topic versus standard versus objective versus theme versus course themes. We need to make sure that that's very clear, right? Okay. Number two, add EG to the parentheses, right? To make sure that people know that these are examples given, not actual suggestions. Connect to the make sure there's clear connections to the overarching themes, right? Justice, agency representation, those overarching themes. The other one I don't have to email to Alan because it's cognitive verb. I'm going to throw that in there. Is there any other recommendations you'd like to make to the editing team this afternoon?
Tony, could I ask you to go back? The bullets, just to be clear, are suggestions or are the things?
They are suggestions. I'm pretty sure, Steve. You tell me. You're the
That's
consultant.
what I'm just confirming
Okay.
that.
You're making sure. Yeah. All right. Yeah. No,
That's
they're
all I'm
suggestions.
doing. I'm not trying to be argumentative. It's 2:34. I'm not going to be argumentative. I'm just checking.
No, yeah, they're definitely suggestions. Any other recommendations that I should share with the editing team?
I just want to thank you all. This has been, your process has been so in-depth and thorough, and it's been really informative and fascinating to get insight into the process and develop a little bit of understanding about where this is headed. But thank you so much, not just for the last 3 days, but the work that you've been doing over the last many months.
Thank you.